Welcome to this webinar on A Life Worth Living, featuring two internationally known speakers and thinkers, David Brooks and Miroslav Volf. I'm Carla Adey, Senior Minister at Country Club Christian Church, and it is my great joy to welcome you tonight. This evening marks the first official event of the church's centennial. And as a part of our 100th anniversary, we wanted to do something to give a gift to the community. And this is the first of those events. I encourage you to watch our website and to attend future events, either virtually or in person. My deep gratitude goes out to the Centennial Committee who made tonight possible, and also to Phil and Patty Love, without whose help tonight would not be happening. And now I would like to introduce to you my colleague, Dr. Mike Graves, who is our scholar in residence and our Minister of Spiritual Formation, who will introduce our speakers.
Well, I would add my welcome as well to Carla's for those who are watching and joining us. But I also have the great privilege of introducing our speakers. David Brooks is a columnist with the New York Times and commentator on National Public Radio and the PBS NewsHour. More recently, he is the chair of WEAVE, the Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute in DC, something he might wish to talk about. And he's the author of 5 books, including most recently, The Road to Character and The Second Mountain. Miroslav Volf is the founder and director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and the Henry B. Wright Professor of Theology at Yale. And his most significant books include the award-winning Exclusion and Embrace, and more recently, Flourishing: Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World. Miroslav is no stranger to our congregation. He lectured here on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and he preached for us just a few years ago. One thing I just want to say to those who have joined us as participants, we have disabled the chat feature, but we're not shutting you out. The Q&A feature, because this is a webinar, is active. We have a lot of questions that have already been submitted, but feel free to submit and we will do our best to get to those. So I'll go ahead and start us off. Since one of you is a columnist for the Times and another a professor of theology at Yale, I thought it might be good to tell people how it is you came to be friends and colleagues with similar interests, especially as it relates to our topic on a life worth living.
I'll go first, maybe.
Yeah, there you go. Go ahead.
So aside from being a columnist, I'm a frustrated academic, and I got invited to teach at Yale. And I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And so I accepted. And I taught the first class I taught was about humility, the virtue of humility. And I thought it'd be hilarious for New York Times students to teach Yale students about humility, which neither New York Times columnists or Yale students have much of. And then I taught a course on commitment making, on how to make commitments. And so what I was trying to teach, my students called the course Therapy with Brooks, because basically we just got together and they spilled their guts about their life. But it was an attempt to teach about what the good life is. And we had a colleague at Yale, Tony Kronman, still there, who wrote a book called The End of Education. And he says, the university really used to be about character formation. Schools were about leading good lives. A headmaster at a Stowe School in Vermont said, we raise students who will be good at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And so that's the kind of character formation they wanted to instill. But universities have since been turned into specialized research institutions. And so all knowledge gets really specialized. And as Kronman writes, the large questions of life, asking about the whole of life, nobody does that. And it comes to seem unprofessional to ask the big questions of life, the questions that any 20-year-old is hungering to ask. And so I was trying to do that, but in a much grander scale. Miroslav was doing it with his course. And so that's how our paths overlap through this similar project of giving some sort of moral education to students who hungered for it and were not getting it.
Yeah, and for me, for myself also, Tony's book was very, very important because he showed this marginalization of what arguably is, but certainly was, the most important question of intellectual life. What kind of life is worthy of our humanity? And there's a shift in universities and a corresponding shift also in culture. Universities then tended also to reflect what was happening in the larger culture. And it's this loss of interest in that question, or loss of ability to pursue it in a way that seems compelling to people. What motivated me, and that's where David's and my interests intersected. And of course, I knew of David because I read occasionally New York Times. What I didn't know that you can have therapy with a New York Times columnist. But students loved those classes. I had one of my doctoral students, Ryan McAnally-Linsky, who is known to at least the staff of the church, took that class, and I got reports about the humility class. It's great.
That's wonderful. So let's start with the basics. Could each of you kind of try and explain, define what you think a life worth living looks like? What do we mean by that? And how do you see each other's work as similar to or distinct from each other in regards to that kind of notion?
So maybe I should continue or start, and then David can complete. You know, I was reading a few years back a sociologist by the name of Hartmut Rosa, and he uses a very simple image of a kind of contemporary person. And basically, he says, since we have privatized our visions of the good life, we have been oriented toward resources for life instead of attending to the vision of the good life. And so his image is then of a painter who is obsessing about all the tools of his or her trade, about studio, about paintbrushes, about easel, about light, and wants to have all the best and never really gets to paint. And I think universities tend to be this way. They train people to have resources for life so that you can deploy it in whatever way you want. And we all then end up in this situation where means to life become the ends of life. And suddenly you are in this squirrel cage and you're running without ever knowing exactly how. And I think some of what David was doing with this Adam 1 and Adam 2 was partly attending to just this kind of a phenomenon. And so for me, this is important then to highlight this question of the goal of our lives. And I suppose very abstractly, I would say, and very personally, I would say, good life is life that is worthy of our humanity. We are human beings, I would say, created in the image of God. Humanity has been given to us, and we need to live these kinds of lives. And maybe I should simply add that for me, that life has a kind of three basic structural components. One concerns the circumstances of life. Life needs to go to a certain degree well. We need to live in peace. We need to not be racked by great illness or something like that. It contains also moral agency. That's life is being led. We are agents. For instance, in Christian tradition and other traditions, love God and love your neighbor. I act in the loving kinds of ways. And then the third component is we feel right. For instance, we rejoice. There's kind of emotional, so to speak, component. And so different folks would place different emphasis on each one of these, sometimes maybe disregard one or the other. But I think you need to have some mixture of the components, and different tradition again would lead you in different paths with regard to those. That's roughly what I think when I think about visions of the flourishing life. And then the debate starts, which one's more attuned with our humanity.
And I would say we were both sort of pushing against the grain, especially at an Ivy League college, but I think in the culture generally. My students first were aware they did not have much of a moral vocabulary. They didn't know what sin was. They didn't know redemption was. There were a lot of words they knew, but they didn't quite know the content growing up in a certain culture. And then they would get out of school and they would call me 5 years later, crushed by something. And they would get dumped by a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or they'd get fired from a job. And Nietzsche has the phrase, "He who doesn't have a why to live for can endure anyhow." I'm sorry, I should say correctly. He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. If you know why you're doing things, you can handle the setbacks. But if you don't know why you're doing the things, then the setbacks really are crushing because it's all gone. And so I recognize these things called the Telos crisis, a crisis of a loss of purpose. And so what they were doing, they were building these tall buildings of achievement with nothing on the foundation. And when they sensed the crisis in the foundation, they'd just build another floor on top. And eventually it would crumble down. And so I would tell them the first thing to do is read that book, Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. Everybody gives it out on convention, graduation day, and do the opposite. In that book, it's about an individual kid rising to success. The kid has no friends, no family, no connections. And yet somehow that's our model, that life is an individual journey. And immigrants, by the way, hate that book because that's not how they see life. And so I would say, first thing, reject your idea of freedom. Your idea of freedom that we're often told is absence of restraint. But think of freedom as the freedom to play the piano involves tying yourself down to the piano and practicing every day. And that's the freedom of capacity, a different kind of freedom. And so what I would tell them, and I would tell adults this, most of us in our lives make 4 big commitments to our lives. And they're to a spouse and family, to a philosophy or faith, to a community, and to a vocation. And the fulfillment of your life will depend on how well you choose and then execute upon those commitments. And a commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. So Jews love their God, but they keep kosher just in case. We need those structures to keep us in line. And so it's about those commitments. And when you make those commitments, you improve your character. When you have a kid who's born, you've made a commitment that you didn't even know was possible. And suddenly you want to serve the kid. You want to be a slightly better person, not play golf on the weekends, play with the kid. And in that way, you sort of cultivate your character. And the final thing I'll say is, and I'll go to Augustine, we all have different kinds of loves. And for Augustine, sin was disordered love, putting a lower love ahead of a higher love. If you tell me a secret and I blab it at a dinner party, I'm putting my love of popularity above my love of friendship. And that's out of order. We know that. And so one should figure out what is the highest possible love. And not to get too Yale-y, but Plato makes it easy. He says there's a ladder of loves. And if you want to teach a student, he says, first show him a beautiful face. That's an easy kind of beauty to see. But then when they see that kind of beauty, they'll realize there's a higher beauty, which is a beautiful personality. And when they see that beauty, they'll say, well, there's even a higher beauty, which is truth and the search for truth. And when they see that beauty, they'll think there's an even higher beauty, which is justice. And when you see that beauty, you'll see there's a higher beauty to which nothing can be added and nothing can be taken away. And that's God, that's transcendence. And so if you think, what are the genuine beauties in my life, and you make commitments to them, you're probably headed in the right direction.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Miroslav. Let's talk about suffering in a life worth living. We are still in the midst of this global pandemic with millions dead, and we're all acutely aware of systemic racism in our country. The social unrest is rampant, and the political polarization continues to plague our nation. And Miroslav, you bring the perspective of your own experience growing up in Croatia with its troubled history and war. And so I'm wondering from both of you, how do you think joy and a life worth living factors in when life can be so harsh for so many, especially right now?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Because suffering seems to cross anything we want to affirm about the goodness of life. And there's plenty of it to go around in the world. Um, you know, I've come to when I did this long study about joy, then I've come to think about joy not simply as joy because there is that kind of joy that is joy because something extraordinary happens or something very small but beautiful in your life happens and something else in you, joy springs out of the goodness of what has transpired. But there's also something like joy despite, almost like an oppositional joy. That is to say, joy in the face of suffering, joy as a form of resistance. There is this, I think it's a spiritual song, or at least that's where I heard about it. I have joy that the world did not give to me, and the world cannot take away. This kind of not being able to take my joy is almost a kind of fundamental stance of pushing against suffering that we are facing. But you know, built into your question was also almost tacitly that somehow expectation is that somehow the good life would be joyous life, the good life would feel good. And maybe we need to also kind of question this. Struggle against racism, you mentioned racism, fight against it is part and parcel of good life. And that struggle itself sometimes leads to suffering. Just ask Jesus what happened in his life when he went on the road to try to reform and preach the good news. Or, you know, David was speaking about Plato. Go back to Plato's teacher, Socrates, and you'll see what happens when you speak the truth with courage in the public square. So these kinds of costs of doing the right thing, I think I want to include in the character of the good life. And that's partly what I was thinking when I said good life, flourishing life has a kind of agential dimension, as well as responsibility and agency, as well as kind of emotional dimension. And besides, one can also rejoice about integrity of one's own and somebody else's action. That is a fantastic kind of joy.
Yeah, I guess I would say first on suffering, you know, when you ask people, well, what experience made you who you are today? Nobody ever says, you know, I had this fantastic vacation in Hawaii. Like, that's not what forms us. We're usually formed by moments of suffering. Almost everybody points to a moment of suffering and hopefully a moment of redemption and overcoming. And so there was a 1950s theologian, Paul Tillich, who said, suffering is an interruption of your life, and it reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. And then he said, what suffering does is it carves into the floor of the basement of your soul, and it carves through that floor and reveals a cavity below, and it carves through that floor and it reveals a cavity below. And so you see deeper into yourself than you do in the normal days of happiness. And you come to realize that only spiritual food will fill those voids. And so I went through a hard period earlier in my life, and somebody gave me this book by Henry Nouwen to read. And he says, stay in the pain long enough to learn what it has to teach you. And I'm like, screw that, I want to get out of the pain. But he's fundamentally right. And so in those moments of suffering, you learn about yourself, you form yourself, you're reformed. And the way I put it in my last book is you're either broken or you're broken open. And some people put on a shell and they never want to feel anything again. And some people actually become more vulnerable in the midst of struggle. And so you come out of the valley in one good way. If you're someone like me who relies too much on external validation, you go off into the wilderness and there's nobody there to applaud. And so it's in those moments that you really find out who you are. And then hopefully at the end, there's joy. I'd like to think there's always joy. I think I'm talking now to Miroslav, Mr. Joy, so I got to be careful what I say. But I think, Miroslav, you wrote that joy is the crown of a well-lived life. And I take that. And the distinction I draw, and you've thought about this more than me, is that you can shoot for happiness. And there's a lot of psychology about happiness. And you get happy when your team wins the Super Bowl, or you get a promotion where you get enlarged, you feel big about yourself. And joy comes in those moments where you're not even aware of yourself at all. You're lost dancing with your friend, you're lost in a cause, you feel you've blended into something bigger than yourself. And there's a great quote in one of my books. I have the Rabbi Miroslav Volf. He's not Rabbi, a different Wolf. I forget his first name now. Rabbi something Wolf. I promoted you to Rabbi.
I'm push against that.
Yeah, but he talks about what it was like to march across the bridge at Selma with King. And he said, we felt this, the world could change. We felt this joyousness of song. And he describes it as this great swelling feeling. So even in the midst of what had to be a scary moment, as Miroslav said, in those moments, you can feel losing yourself into joy.
Miroslav, before the next question, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think there are different. There is this kind of joy that David has just described, that the kind of a joy of certain kind of a flow, and probably certain kind of flow also, not simply on the dance floor with ecstasy in your system, but dance for marching over the bridge in the good cause, right? So so that there's this kind of, but there are also, I think, other kinds of joys which seem to me are joy. I differentiate it from feelings of pleasure. Feeling of pleasure need not have an object. Intentional object. I can just feel happy just because I'm happy. I smoke something and I feel happy. With joy, it doesn't work that way. Joy has to be kind of, I think, over something, intentional object. And it's a good to which it is tied. And I think that's what gives joy this kind of robustness and ties it to the character of very existence, rather than kind of floating as a free feeling above it. To me, that joy that ends up being joy of a kind of recognizing and delighting in the goodness that is there, even sometimes when the goodness is very arduous one.
Yeah, I with this Weave project I do, we celebrate community builders around the country, and I get to work from time to time with Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist. And for him, joy is not a moment; it's a permanent state. And as you were saying, it's like when he meets a human being, it's as if he's never met one before, and he's like, "Wow, these creatures are amazing." And he's just delighted by it. And then, oh, look, there's another one. There's another one. And so he's so in love with the idea of a human being that he rides on that just a joyous state and radiates it out to all who meet him.
Beautiful.
Thank you, David. David, in your book, The Second Mountain, you talk about being an amphibian when it comes to religion, with one foot in Judaism and one foot in Christianity. And I've noticed that a lot of folks find themselves part one thing and part another, maybe part Christian and part atheist, I don't know, a combination of things, part Buddhist. And Miroslav, you've written about the interfaith dialogue in our pluralistic world. And one of our viewers submitted a question that says, how do we navigate the vast ocean of ideologies and theologies to find a foundation from which to base a life worth living? So there's all these ideas out there. So I'm wondering if each of you could reflect on how religious faith factors into a life worth living and how your own faith has shaped your own personal quest for a life worth living.
Okay, I'll start, I guess, this one. So I was raised in a Jewish home and in Lower East Side of Manhattan. My great-grandfather was a kosher butcher, and my grandfather was a lawyer. My father's a professor. It was the normal Jewish route. But I went to an Episcopal school called Grace Church School, which is, if anybody knows New York, it's the Strand bookstore is right around the corner on 10th Street. And I was in the choir. We called it the All Jewish Boys Davening Choir at Grace, because we were like 40% Jewish, and we would sing the hymns. But to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus, so the volume would go down in the choir and then come back. And then I went to an Episcopal camp until I was really 23. So this was my childhood. It was going to Hebrew school, going to church every day, going to Hebrew school, going to church. And I was confronted with two different forms of goodness. The Jewish form of goodness was in the home, in the Friday night dinner table. There's a phrase called Hamish, which is just warm and embracing. But then I met a lot of people through the churches that I was going to, who had a different kind of goodness, and it was like agape. It was selfless love, and I got to see this in person. And so I lived with these two stories, and lived with them, but it didn't really matter because I didn't believe in God. So they were just two stories and two moral traditions, which I derived benefit both from. And then I, many years later in my 50s, really started coming to faith. But again, it was drawn by beauty. And somehow the Old Testament suddenly seemed real to me. Like not just wisdom literature, but actually a covenant with the divine being. But at the same time, the ultimate beauty for me was the Beatitudes. That was where the celestial grandeur broke through. And so I became either the most Jewy Christian or the most Christiany Jew. But in reality, once you accept the Beatitudes as divine essence, you've crossed the other side. And my Jewish friends tell me, it doesn't really work that way. You don't get to be both. And they're probably right. But I will say that coming from a Jewish background is to see Jesus in a certain way. He's not the guy in the Florentine paintings, the blonde guy with his fingers in the air. To know Israel well, which I do, is to know it is a land of spiritual and literal warfare in Jesus' day and in our own. And so to see him in that context, coming from the spot where all the revolutions were coming from in that time, going to all these power structures and upsetting them all in a stroke, is to see, forgive my language, Jesus as a total badass, as a man doing conflict, doing argument, upsetting things. And it's not the peacefulness of a church pew or a home study. It's really fraught. And so I see him through the Jerusalem lens. I found, by the way, for pastors, I really love pastors who really appreciate the Jewishness of Jesus and walk away from those who don't, who don't appreciate it. And so what finally happened is just faith came. And so the stories became real. They became living stories. I could go on about this journey for a long time, but I've emerged humbler, and I hope with a higher sense of that the world is more enchanted than I ever would have imagined as a younger person.
That's beautiful, David. So my own faith journey, I think, starts with my father's death march. When he was 18, after World War II, he was on a death march, and completely innocent person. But I won't go into the whole story. And was furious at God for letting that happen to him. But in the midst of the greatest pain, greatest humiliation, somebody bore witness to him to the love of God, and which infuriated my father even more. Because how can God be love when I am in this hell? And David said faith came to him. And I think that's probably how my father would would have said as well, and would say as well. It's not that he found God, but that God found him, found a way to him in that situation, so that in the midst of this hell, he can discover the God of love. And that was a kind of almost like a contradiction. And I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about what is it that made it possible for him? What kind of eternal protest against the reality that he was experiencing was it that made his conversion possible? And what I think is that he would have been eaten away by the evil that he was experiencing had he not latched onto the good in the person of Jesus Christ and in God. And that story has become a kind of guiding light of my life, and takes me always back to the fundamental character of God's love. And maybe that's where stories that David told and that I'm telling intersect. But I want to say something. You asked about different religions, philosophers, and conflicting visions of the good life. So I'm a very comfortable and happy as a Christian, but have a strong appreciation for other traditions. What I think binds these various religious and philosophical traditions is a certain kind of faith. I don't think, and I don't know whether David will agree with me on this, but I don't think that the vision of good life can be formulated on scientific basis alone. Vision of a good life is a normative question. It's not a question of description. So let's say some machine, say Google, knows absolutely everything about me. I give Google freedom to collect all the data. I guess I have already given by using Gmail. To collect all the data, and they know my entire history, and then some very smart algorithm can predict what I would buy, they could predict what I would even want. But what they could not tell me is what I should want. And I think the vision of a good life is what one should be, what is worthy of my humanity, not what I happen or anybody else or aggregate of humanity happens to think. And in that sense, I think the good life is always about certain kind of faith. And I think then the interesting question becomes when various faiths begin to have a conversation about the good life. And on the surface, they may be very similar. Deep down, they may be quite different. Deeper still down, they may be again very similar. And I think some of these discussions end up being really fascinating, really, really interesting. For me, they have been generating, and they have strengthened in some ways my faith, but also opened me up to learning from other traditions and enriching my own Christian faith.
David, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm trying to do it's a very deep comment. I'm thinking of especially different faith traditions of different what faith is in different traditions, and having been in two, Jewish faith is of the world. And this is something I struggled with going more into the Christian world, where people say, well, even C.S. Lewis says this is an inn, our home is somewhere else. And that's not a concept that would prevail in the Jewish world, because the Jewish world, it's right here. And part of the exercise of faith is fixing the world. And so Jews have trouble thinking about heaven because it's already been fixed. So what's the point? And I would say in my life, and even keeping kosher for decades, I didn't quite experience faith the way I did later. And it was, and I'm not saying this of all Jews. A lot of Jews are very spiritual, very extremely spiritual, but when I crossed over, I came to experience a sense of things clicking into place. I was on a mountaintop in Colorado, and there was a sense of a whole moral order and a God's loving hand clicking into place, and things fitting together in a way that was not visible. And this sense was not like a bolt out of blue. It's not like Jesus walking on the water over to me. It happened with great gradualness. And so my coming to faith, I describe it as you're sitting in a train, and everyone's sitting around you. It's normal that people are drinking their coffee, and you look out your window and you suddenly realize there's a lot of ground behind you, and that you've crossed a border into another realm. And that is the realm of faith, of thinking the world is alive and it's alive with a certain story that's expressed in the Bible and expressed in the person of Jesus. And so I'm not giving a very academic answer, because it's something I have to think hard about different kinds of faith and different faith traditions. And I suppose in the Eastern faith traditions, you know this better than I, Miroslav, there's more an erasure of self in the way there isn't in a Jewish or a Christian tradition. But whether I would love to read about this, whether the actual experience of meeting God has a different element, different style, different flavor, and different traditions is something I just don't know about.
Well, you know what I was thinking actually about. So there is, when I say faith, I think about kind of the entirety of the way of life that is embodied in a particular tradition. And some of it has to do with this more existential faith, but some of it has to do with the way in which, in that faith tradition, the self is perceived, the relations between human beings and the good are understood. And there are differences between Buddhism and how Buddhism understands self, and how the self is understood in Jewish or Christian or even Muslim monotheist kinds of traditions. And I think also that their corresponding visions of what one aspires to be differ depending on what the differences in their accounts of reality of this large story of which you were speaking. And I think for me, the Christian faith is both this kind of existential kind of discovery, as you would describe, of the beauty and the vibrancy of what is that reality can really carry me, that something underneath the reality carries me through life. But at the same time, it is the attitudes, it is the teachings of Jesus. And I don't think that these two are kind of disparate. They kind of belong together in a faith tradition. And so in that sense, conversations with Islam or conversations with Buddhism will give you different accounts of faith and therefore of the good life. But can I go back to I want to ask you a question. Like you, I am a total in my commitment. I'm a total Jesus freak. Jesus is so central, and I think Jesus has been always central to the Christian faith. But my experience of today's cultures of modernity is this: that Jesus has become a moral stranger to us. What he thought was important, we generally think it isn't important. What we think is really important, he generally thought wasn't important. And so one of my big desires and kind of both pains and kind of hopes. Pain is that to see Jesus kind of losing grip or losing attractiveness in the culture of today. And I wanted your comment. You obviously had a very different experience than what I'm describing.
Yeah, well, the first thing that leaps to mind is that Jesus was trying to build a movement and trying to attract people to his cause And you would think for a guy who's trying to do that, to evangelize, well, rich people would be very useful.
Yeah,
They'd
exactly.
give you money, they'd have great connections, and you could really go big. He doesn't care about any of them.
Yeah.
And the people he accepts, the people he ministers to are quite the opposite.
Yeah.
And so I think it's hard for us to live with that radicalism. And it's hard for us to live with that kind of purity. You know, one of my, and I think about this in daily life. So one of my heroes is a woman named Dorothy Day, who was a Catholic worker who not only served the poor, but lived amongst the poor for 60 years. And her only goal in life was to live the way Jesus did. And if anybody I've read about, I think she really achieved a kind of purity to her life. Mm-hmm. But it was a purity where she's working in a homeless shelter, living in a homeless shelter, paying herself nothing, and doing a great deal of suffering, frankly, along the way. A lot of bad smells, crazy people. And another kind of woman I admire who lived at about the same time was a woman named Frances Perkins, who was FDR's first Secretary of Labor, first woman in the cabinet. And she wanted to serve worker rights. But she became sort of a politician. And so Day needed to be pure. Perkins was willing to lead a life of political compromise, of working with anybody, mafioso, machine politicians, whoever she needed to cut a deal with, she'd cut a deal. And to me, these are two sorts of goodnesses. One is a purity. One is someone who's willing to take the sins of the situation on themselves and make moral compromises in order to achieve a good end. And I'm now forgetting how, but Day is really the radicalism of Jesus. And it's not the only way. On the one hand, you want to say it's the only way, but I don't want to criticize Frances Perkins.
No, I wouldn't disagree with you on this, but presumably I would say, I think of Jesus, whoever loves, when Jesus says, whoever loves his parents or his relations more than they love me is not worthy of me. It seems to me kind of radical statement, but if I look back and to our father Abraham and his experience with God, God was no less radical than was Jesus, right? The entire progeny had to be given up for the sake of the commitment to this one God. And I mean, whichever that route takes you, this commitment to God, but the kind of fundamental commitment to who God is, as opposed to some kind of calculus of well-being for myself or whatever else I think is valuable, that seems to be the radicalism of Jesus. That has to be at the center of it, which is just a different way of saying that's a radicalism of monotheism.
Yeah, and you know, when we think what's the good life, you and I, we write in categories, and Jesus' answer is not a set of words, it's a person, it's a way. Yeah. And that radically upsets people who are more intellectually inclined, because there are a lot of, like, I think about this in my work, how do you rebuild trust in society? Well, my normal instinct is to want to come up with a formula or a project, but Jesus is a way. The message is the person, it's the personalism. And I think in rebuilding trust in society, it's not a project, it's just the right people who know how to be trustworthy.
Yeah, trustworthy.
And so the person and personalism is itself a radical way of thinking.
This is a good place for us to jump on another question that was submitted, and it is kind of about the radical nature of Jesus as well, although it's broader than that. And the question is about poverty. We know Jesus taught about the poor, and the stock market is soaring, but there's another kind of economy that's going on, right? The middle class is suffering, many of them. Obviously, the lower class, the poor, are suffering tremendously. So the question that was submitted is, what does the good life look like for someone who has nothing, especially when our culture tends to say that prosperity is what the good life looks like? So what do we say to those who are struggling financially?
I guess I'll say two things. People sometimes ask me, well, all this stuff you're talking about virtue and goodness, isn't that a luxury of people who have some sort of middle class stability? And my answer is that I've been in a lot of poor parts of the world, and I've been in a lot of poor parts of America. I've never met anybody who didn't hunger for goodness, who didn't have a soul that yearned. And the mosques and synagogues and churches of the world are filled with very poor people whose spiritual life is rich and seeking. And we're taught that the poor are closer to God for good reason, because I think in many ways they have access to a certain direct experience of him that people with all the accoutrements of affluence don't have. Having said that, so it's not related to how much money you have. And I certainly would, it's not been my experience that rich people are more spiritual than poor people. That's sort of been the reverse of my experience. Having said that, it's hard to believe you could lead a good life or lead a Christian life without devoting a large part of it to service to those on the margins. You mentioned Weave, this project. So basically our theory is that the social fabric and social distrust undergird a lot of the problems, the loss of dignity. You mentioned African Americans and people not feeling seen, people not feeling heard, African Americans feeling correctly that white people don't have a clue of what their daily experience is like. People at the poor in the middle of the country feeling that rich people on the coasts don't give them dignity and respect. And so where do you go to fix that? Well, Jesus teaches us, go to the margins, go to the furthest margin you can possibly find, and find the people who are working on the margin, and those people will be the answer. So for example, I have a friend in Waco, Texas named Jimmy Durrell, and he's a pastor in Waco, and the homeless would not come into his church. And so he took his church to the homeless. There's a highway underpass where the homeless sleep, and he created church there outside under the overpass. It's called Church Under the Bridge. And he's a person who radiates just joy and rapture because he goes right to the margins. And that's the call. And so there's an odd relationship between spiritual fulfillment and worldly success, and often inverse. But surely every form of spiritual fulfillment involves some going to the margin and solidarity and accompaniment with people there.
Yeah, I would just echo what David has said actually on both points. And as you were reading this question, I kind of had mental note to myself: it's harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom than for the poor person. I think that the idea behind it is also that kind of the hungry, the poor ones who are hungry, that they're broken, as David earlier mentioned, and can be open in order to receive. And strangely enough, they can be much more generous often than the rich people are. Maybe that's empathy, knowing exactly the situation of want and sharing the little that one has. And that's not to in any way kind of sanctify poverty. It's to point that there is a resource deep down inside for an incredibly rich kind of life, from which we who are much better off can learn tremendously. I was raised by a nanny who was a 56-year-old woman left without a husband after World War II. And we had 3 rooms and she had none, so she came to stay with us and became my quote unquote nanny. Completely impoverished woman, but was radiating incredible joy. I have dedicated my first book to her, and she was the angel of my childhood. This kind of beauty is absolutely, I think, extraordinary, and kind of seriousness about spiritual life, about inner life, about inner beauty. She was a she was a five. She was 4'8" in height. Babushka always wore a scarf, had a mustache, and to this day, I think she's the most beautiful woman that I have. One of the most beautiful women that I've seen, because there's something beauty from inside radiated on the outside. To me, that's really significant, which is to take nothing away from the need to support, need to transform indeed the system in which we are, because I think it's a systemic issue, the incredible levels of wealth discrepancy that exist in order to address the questions of poverty, from individual engagement to significant political economic changes.
Thank you both. The life worth living conversation sometimes feels very individualized, and yet the two of you both clearly value community. And so I'm wondering what you would say to us as church leaders and to this congregation that's celebrating its 100th anniversary. What is it that we can do as members of community to weave together the fabric of our larger city and community? What's our calling?
Well, I'll just tell you.
I was going to say, David, that's yours, because I'm a Yale academic, so that's beyond my pay grade. But both you folks who work in the church and David, you with your experiences and initiatives, you're the person to talk.
I mean, I'll just tell you a couple stories of people like Jimmy Durrell, who we call weavers. I've got my little badge on because I just got off of a weave event. And basically, like Aisha Butler's a woman in Englewood in Chicago, and she was going to move out of Englewood because it was a dangerous neighborhood, and she had a 9-year-old daughter. And she decided that they were going to move out, but then as the moving van was coming, she looked across the street, and she saw a 9-year-old girl playing in an empty lot with broken bottles. And so she turns to her husband and says, "We're not going to leave. We're not going to be just another family that left Englewood." And so she Googles volunteer in Englewood, and she starts volunteering, and now she runs something called Rage, which is the community group. And now if you go to Englewood, in the stores, there'll be t-shirts that says "Proud son of Englewood, proud daughter of Englewood." And so there's a spirit, a spiritual revival, and it's a better looking neighborhood because she's understood, which I think is the reality, is the neighborhood is the unit of change. You don't just pick one person, you have to change the whole neighborhood and the common love. There's a group, Emily Gordon at Root of Empathy. What they do is they take kids and they teach them empathy. And the way they do it is they take a mom and an infant, a toddler. They bring him into a room, an 8th grade classroom, and the kids sit around the toddler and they try to guess what's going on in the toddler's head as he reaches for things and walks around and does stuff. So they're learning to say, what would it be like to be him? And one day there was a kid who'd been held back, and he was big and he was a little scary looking. He'd been through the foster system and seen his mom killed. And he goes up to the mom with the toddler and he says, "Can I hold your baby?" And the mom is a little nervous because the kid looks scary and he's bigger than everybody else. But she hands it to him, and the kid is wonderful with the baby. He puts it on his chest, nuzzles him, and then hands it back. And he starts asking questions about what it's like to be a parent. And the final question is, do you think you can be a good father if you've never been loved? And so what this organization is doing is reaching to kids like that and giving them a sense of community. Now, the kinds of things I've just talked about are kind of heroic, and most of us are not going to do that. But you can have one friendship with somebody outside your normal group, or you can invite your neighbors out to dinner. You can do one. You need a technology of convening. You need to do one thing, like a dinner table where you go around and ask a certain sort of question, or a picnic table outside in COVID. It's just one set of regular senses to build connection and trust with some group of people unlike yourself. And we can all do that. And if that became normal in America, we'd have a very different country.
So, Miroslav and David, this is a question for both of you. Miroslav, the class, A Life Worth Living at Yale, most popular class among undergrads, clearly wrestling with the questions. It seems to me, David, that Second Mountain is a later in life, typically kind of thing, although you note it's not always. So I'm kind of wondering what y'all think about people pursuing, searching for, seeking a life worth living at different stages of life. Obviously, we have people at various stages of life in the congregation and on this webinar. So what's your response to that? You want to go first, Miroslav?
Sure. Just a correction, it's not the most popular class at Yale. That distinction goes to psychology and the good life. But it is which was a tremendous success. And the two are not completely unrelated courses. Psychology and good life I would describe as a course about a kind of coping with difficulties in life, kind of coping strategies for students. Ours is much more, if you want, kind of ends oriented, and the two can really in many ways work together. But it is a fairly popular class. We have many more students that we can accommodate with the way we teach the class. And I see tremendous thirst for exploring this question, for orienting oneself. My sense is that a lot of students who come to Yale, they've been shepherded through life from the time when they were preschoolers, and their parents were aiming them toward Yale, and often they never had the opportunity to ask themselves, why are they doing what they're doing? What's the purpose of this whole thing? I remember also one student, we started talking about interior life and the importance of what happens inside one. And she was completely puzzled by this. She was all living on the outside. What matters is really what is being perceived, how she's being perceived, because how she's being perceived, that defines her status, and that's how a progress up the ladder of success happens. But that there's kind of beauty that nobody sees, but that is actually fundamental to our humanity. That was a kind of new idea to her. When I hear stories of this sort, or another student who basically said, a very, very smart student from India, she said, I've never gotten permission to take these questions of the meaning of life with intellectual seriousness. And suddenly this course opens it up for her. That's, I think, absolutely fantastic. So I think this is a critical and crucial stage, and the students are really ripe to take those questions. I'm sure they'll probably kind of the interest in them will maybe subside. I hope that something will remain. We actually ask students to write a kind of my vision of life worth living as a kind of 5-page final assignment, and they commit themselves to revisit it, and after 5 years to try to write it again, so as to encourage ongoing participation in that. So I think there are particular stages that maybe are crucial, and so is also later in life, as David has also done and suggested, and as in many traditions you can see, once you've had your kind of success of, to use David's language, in Adam 1, then you come to the second phase of life, and there you can kind of retreat from the active life. You can nurture your spiritual self. That happens also in today's world, I think. And I would say there may be some moments in life that are of significance in a chronology of life, but also it's a perennial question that accompanies everything else that we do? And that's what I hope that we can achieve, to raise that question so that that becomes a guiding, accompanying and guiding thinking about what we do in our everyday life.
You know, as you were talking with a woman who didn't have the sense of the inner, I just read a very interesting book about the voice in our head, the silent voice that talks in our head. And
Yeah.
a significant number of people don't hear a voice in their head. They're just, and I try to tell this about to my wife sometimes when I'm watching football or something. It's just like, she'll say, "What are you thinking?" And I'm like, "No, it's a nothing box. There's nothing going on in there. It's just empty right now." But occasionally it speaks up. But some people have no voice in their head.
Yeah.
And healthy people apparently talk to themselves in the third person. I don't do that. My voice doesn't do that. The other thing that I was reminded of, the best compliment I ever got from a student at the end of a term, he said was, "Your course has made me a lot sadder." And because he had it all going on, and now I'd introduced a new set of problems.
Yeah, there we go.
I do think there are different stages of moral development. And in the last book, I have this metaphor of the two mountains. And basically, you get out of school or you're young and you have a certain task to build up your identity, build up your ego, to achieve some sense of impact in the world. And then usually you either succeed beyond your dreams and you find it completely unsatisfying, which was my story, or you fail, or something bad happens that wasn't part of the plan, like a cancer scare or whatever. And so you're in the valley and you realize the things you wanted on your first mountain were not really worth wanting. And that's when the second mountain begins. And my book is about what happens after the valley. There's another book I highly recommend, though you should buy mine first, by Richard Rohr, a Franciscan monk, called Falling Upward, which is the same sort of deal. And he wrote his book before mine, so he gets credit. But this is a common life story. One of the best things I ever did with my column is I asked people over 70 to write me life reports, to grade themselves on how they had done in life. And they tended to give themselves A- professional and B- relational. And the people who had succeeded or were most fulfilled, they broke their life into chapters. So they said, okay, the next 7 years are a chapter in my life. What do I want those 7 years to be about, or those 5 years? The people who were most unsuccessful or most unfulfilled, it was just one day after a time without breaking their life into purposeful, intentional chapters. And I find, talking to seniors especially, when you're 14 or 15 or 16, somehow the eros gets lit up in you. When you're 60, somehow generativity gets lit up in you. And you really have this almost primal urge to give back. And I notice it in almost every senior I know. And so riding that beautiful impulse is what happens at the second stage of life. Richard Rohr's language is you build your container in the first stage, and then you break all the rules in the second stage. The other thing I learned from my life reports, it's a banality, but it's true and worth reminding. I had 5,000 people write in about their lives. There was only one out of those 5,000 who had regrets about taking a risk. In almost every other life story, the risk, whether it worked out or didn't, was people were tremendously grateful.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've come pretty much to the end of our time. We have one question, and you get just the briefest answer, right? So as succinct as you can be. One of your colleagues, Miroslav at Pepperdine, a year and a half ago, said, they said to the course there, the students at Yale, Muslims pray 5 times a day. What do you do several times a day that shapes you? Checking emails or whatever. So many people have asked, submitted questions. What's something I could do to shape my life toward a more meaningful, purposeful life? David, you want to go first, and then we'll let Miroslav.
Eating chips shapes me, not in a good way. I'm not a great prayer. My wife keeps a spiritual journal. I see her prayer journal, and it's roots her. I weirdly, maybe it's just me, I need to have a spiritual book going at all times. So whether it's an Allen book or a Lewis book or whatever, my brain it's reactive. I react to the spiritual message being sent to me. And so to me, it's mostly about reading and living in the environment that the author is describing, either the Bible or something else.
I think I would say, as David did, reading for me is really very important, but also, practices, something like gratitude, or what I find really very interesting and what I try to regularly return to. Dante in his Paradiso has on the lowest rank of kind of ladder to the closeness of closeness to God. His souls, and he talks to the souls are being addressed, and the question was, how come you don't envy those who are up much higher than you are? How come you can be satisfied? And then they say, we long for what we have. We long for what we have. Now, kind of this capacity and training oneself to long for what one has, I think is such a fundamental skill and practice. Obviously, we long for what we don't have, and we want to receive that. But to learn how to long for what we have will prevent us from constantly chasing our tail and living a life actually of satisfaction, of beauty, and of at peace with the beauty that we encounter and goodness we encounter.
Thank you so much, Miroslav. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to the webinar. It's been a great, rich conversation, and we appreciate everyone's participation. A recording of tonight's webinar will be available tomorrow on our website, ccccKC.org. And I think if you've registered, you will get an email directing you to find that on the website. All of you are also invited to sign up for the Life Worth Living course. That course starts mid-February, and we still have some space available, but we will soon be opening up a spring course as well. So you can find all that information on our website. Again, thank you. It's been a joy.
Thank you.